Okay, looks like everybody's here. Wonderful. Welcome to today's webinar on Authorization Amplified, and I'm delighted to be joined by two of our payments experts here at Forter, and we're going to be talking about different strategies for increasing your e-commerce authorization rates. Who doesn't want that? So I'm going to hand you over to Jeff, our Global Head of Payments, and to Adam, our Payments Lead here at Forter for the session. If at any point you've got a question that you want to ask, please feel free to drop it into the chat or into the Q&A. And also, before I forget, I did promise you lunch or dinner or breakfast or whatever time it is where you are. So I'm pasting a little code into the chat, and you can use that to claim your own $30 Uber Eats voucher, or if you're in the UK, you can turn that into a Deliveroo voucher. So enjoy lunch on us. Okay, over to you, Adam and Jeff.
Thanks, Kirsty. Great to see everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar. Like Kirsty said, my name is Jeff Hollenbeck. I am the Global Head of Payments here at Forter. I am lucky enough to be joined by Adam Davies. Adam is our payments lead here at Forter. Adam comes to Forter with a strong background of Visa and Stripe and basically every major player in the payment space. So super lucky to have him join us today. On the right side of this slide, you'll see some of the things we're going to talk about. Obviously, it's hard to cram every single optimization strategy around payments into a 30-minute session, but we've tried to narrow down kind of where we think there's big opportunity and where we think the industry is going. In order, we're going to talk about what you should be doing today, just assessing your current performance, what types of things you should be looking at, how should you segment. We're going to be talking about architecture, so where placement of things like authentication and authorization calls, what that means to a merchant strategy. Talk about sharing transaction context. This is a topic near and dear to my heart. And then we're talking about how do you test all this stuff? How do you test minute payload optimization tweaks here and there? Forter at its core is a modeling company. So how to do multivariate and A/B testing in tandem is super relevant and important when you talk about, okay, I've got 20 optimization ideas. Which one do I try first? Kirsty's going to keep us on point in terms of time. She's going to keep us on point in terms of questions. So feel free to use the chat. We're going to be monitoring that and interrupting ourselves as we can to make sure it's as informative as possible. All right, without further ado, let's dive in. Let's talk about opportunity. My background is merchant payments side for the past decade or so. A lot of the times when we looked at our monthly business reviews, our quarterly business reviews, and we do this today with our customers at Forter, we talk about, okay, we'll just break down your declines. Why are issuing banks declining your transactions? What are you seeing? And the reality is, if you dive into that data with your processor or on the merchant side or a data science team or a service provider like us, you're going to be able to categorize them in a couple different ways. The easiest way that I think about categorizing issuer declines is 3 buckets: policy declines, risk declines, often called strategy declines if you're talking to an issuer, and processing issues. Policy declines could be something like insufficient funds. It could be expired card. It could be a CVV2 decline. These are strict policies, hard nose from the issuer. You have to have this, you got to have a card number that exists, right? Simple thing is that you can't get past them. Insufficient funds, they don't have money in the account, can't get past it. Risk declines, the second category is, hey, issuer doesn't trust this for whatever reason. It might be the amount, might be the velocity, it might be coming from an untrustworthy merchant, a merchant they don't know yet. We talk about warming up mids, new mids kind of often run into a higher percentage of strategy or risk declines from the issuing side. And then there's processing errors. Your PSPs are not perfect. I hate to break that to you, but a lot of times they don't format the payload correctly. They might put the wrong currency on a transaction. They might fail out, timeout, and you have to deal with a processor error. So if you are looking at your decline categories and you can bucket them into, at least at a high level, these 3 areas and start to pie chart out, okay, what's recoverable? How do I look at these? Are these segments going up? Are they going down? We put some notes on the bottom left of this slide that just talk about different ways to break these things out. Do you have one-time transactions versus recurring? Do you have different MCCs? Are you a marketplace? Are you processing in different regions of the world? Which processors do you use? What's your issuer mix look like? You can segment these three categories a number of different ways based on your business. But at its core, if you don't understand how your declines are broken out, you're going to really have a hard time focusing on what's going to bring the most value to your business. All right, as we transition that, so okay, core understanding, decline categories. Why? Why might some of these things be higher, lower based on your merchant, your industry, or category? The first step, like we talked about on the agenda, is going to be architecture. How's your commerce stack sequenced? You've got a checkout page, you've got a submit order button, you've got order management flows, you got logistics, you got inventory, you've probably got a call out to your processor, you've probably got authentication, you've probably got a risk service, lots of moving parts. So as you start to understand where opportunity lies, looking at how your stack is configured is going to mean a lot. So Adam's going to walk you through his background from what he's seen at Stripe and Visa and now at Forder to the different flavors of sequencing a merchant might have and how that can affect your decline categories.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So I've had the privilege through my career of seeing a lot of different merchant configurations, and one thing that has really stood out as a learning from that is the importance of understanding the sequencing of your stack when optimizing authorization rates, especially when it comes to where the fraud decisioning sits and being able to understand the risk level of a transaction early on in order to inform your subsequent decisions around how you process that transaction. So the way that we're thinking about this, obviously, there's a number of different paths, but we're going to break it into three key steps that we associate with a transaction. Now, the first component is the fraud decision. So, of course, assessing the risk level of transaction in order to then take those risk insights and use them to drive our subsequent decisions that we're going to make. The second component is deciding whether to apply 3DS authentication. So a decision that is best informed by the risk level for the transaction and any liability shift considerations that we may wish to make around the risk level. Do we want to push the liability for any potential chargebacks towards the issuer via a smart use of 3DS? Or are we satisfied that this is low risk and we're outside of a regulatory market where 3DS is not required, in which case we can consider direct to authorization? And then the third component is, of course, the issuer's authorization decision. This contains a mix of both their own fraud risk assessment and, of course, confirmation that the customer has sufficient funds. Now, merchants often use 3DS for specific countries, but today, in some of the setups that we see, they aren't cleaning that volume first. So instead, they're relying on this fraud liability shift to the bank that they're securing through 3DS. But it means that by taking this approach, the merchant is essentially sending all of their traffic through 3DS or all of the traffic that they deem for these specific geographies, and then relying on the outcome of 3DS as essentially an insight into the fraud level or the risk for those transactions. And inadvertently, by taking this approach, the merchant is training the bank's risk models to consider that traffic as higher risk because on average, the total volume coming through 3DS from that merchant is a higher risk because that super high risk kind of clearly junk fraudulent traffic isn't being filtered out ahead of time. And additionally, something to note from a cost efficiency perspective, the merchant's then paying 3DS fees for all those junk transactions that could have been filtered out earlier in the flow. So the timing of fraud decisioning matters for cost, conversion, and from a risk management perspective. And really just to put this in the simplest way possible, who has the better understanding of the transaction risk, the merchant or the issuer? The merchant has a huge amount more visibility into the data points and risk indicators associated with a transaction than the issuer does. The issuer is relying on, if it goes through 3DS, the fields that are available to communicate data through 3DS. And if not, they're just relying on the few data points that they have available within the authorization request message. So we want the best quality risk decisions, which can happen on the merchant side, to happen first. Pre-auth fraud decisioning acknowledges this, and it acknowledges that merchants have that significantly deeper insight into the risk. So to really expand on the advantages of this flow, where we have authorization first, the kind of fraud assessment pre-authorization as the first step in the process. There are a number of very clear advantages here, and I've touched on some of these already. So gaining higher approval rates, obviously by removing junk transactions up front, you're ensuring a cleaner set of traffic is being sent to the issuers, and you're achieving a higher authorization rate as a result of that. This also improves your relationships with the issuing bank, or at the very least, their perception of you as a merchant. You'll be perceived as a lower risk merchant because the traffic coming from you is generally more trustworthy. There's generally not any junk transactions coming through there. You're eliminating unnecessary processing costs by no longer paying the fees to process either a 3DS request or an authorization for those junk transactions. And you're able to eliminate card testing. So if you're not doing a pre-auth fraud assessment for the transaction, any card testing attacks that you may have if you're experiencing a period of increased fraud pressure, those card testing transactions will simply be sent through to whether it's 3DS or straight to authorization. They'll likely get blocked at the 3DS stage or at the bank authorization level, but that's going to lead to a spike in your volume, a spike in the cost of processing those transactions, and an increase in the riskiness associated with you as a merchant from the card networks that are observing that traffic going through 3DS and from the issuers that are receiving those requests at authorization.
Hi,
It
Adam.
also enables,
Just a
oh,
wee
go ahead, Kirsty.
just a wee question. Should be a straightforward one for you. Somebody just asking you to clarify what is 3DS exactly?
Sure, great question. So 3DS stands for three domain security. It's essentially an authentication protocol that exists in parallel to the authorization infrastructure. It enables a merchant to submit a request via the card networks to the issuer's what we call an access control server, which is essentially the technology enabler for the issuer within 3DS infrastructure. And that ACS will initiate a challenge to the customer. So you may have seen this as a consumer where you're asked to log into your mobile banking app or enter a six-digit one-time password that's been sent to you via text. It's essentially an opportunity for the bank to review additional data associated with that transaction and then challenge potentially if they see a reason to do so from the risk perspective, challenge that customer to authenticate their identity. Now, once the customer has overcome that challenge, the liability will actually shift to the issuer for any chargebacks that come from that transaction. And that reflects the fact that the issuer had a chance to authenticate their customer. They were responsible for that challenge flow, or they were responsible for a frictionless 3DS decision where no challenge was issued because it looked super trustworthy from their perspective. So 3DS can be very useful for merchants in terms of shifting that liability for chargebacks and reducing fraud costs. But it also has the potential to introduce friction, which can harm conversion because we know customers don't like additional friction in the checkout flow. It tends to drive abandonment. Sometimes it can drive failure. Maybe they don't have their phone nearby to enter an OTP and they're on their desktop, or perhaps for any other reason they're unable to receive it. They're in an area of low service, for example. So just resuming into the list here. So we just talked about eliminating card testing as a benefit of pre-auth. Another really useful one is being able to share data with the networks and the banks. So this actually links quite closely to what we were just talking about with 3DS. One of the benefits of 3DS is it creates essentially this alternative pipeline for sending data through to the bank. We're also seeing a lot of investment across the industry and from Fortress specifically in alternative kind of proprietary rails between merchants and banks to share that enhanced and enriched data with issuers to improve the quality of their decision making. And this links back to the point we made earlier, which is a merchant has a much deeper insight into the risk level of transaction because of the visibility that they have. And we're using these data sharing initiatives with banks to share some of that deep insight and improve the quality of issuer decision making. And lastly, it gives you the option to leverage 3DS, which obviously we've just covered as well. So let's examine a real life example. So here we're tracking the bank authorization rate for two merchants, merchant A, merchant B. Merchant A has, in this example, approximately 500 million in bank declines. So a 1% reduction in those declines would unlock roughly 5 million of incremental revenue per year. Now, in April last year, merchant B shifted from post-auth fraud processing to pre-auth. So this exact kind of sequencing change that we're discussing. And you can see that marked by the blue line on the chart here. What we see is an immediate divergence in the auth rate performance for these two merchants, despite them being closely aligned up until April last year, from around 84 to 88% to 91 to 95%. Meanwhile, merchant A, who hasn't made that shift, continues to average between that kind of 84 to 88% range, but with greater volatility in performance as well, which you can see through the spikes throughout the remainder of the year. And that's as a result of shifts in fraud pressure throughout the year, which aren't being proactively filtered out prior to the bank authorization. So maybe one of the dips there was increased activity from a ring of fraudsters that were targeting the merchant specifically. So this sequencing change, specifically for merchant A here, who we know has 500 million in declines and a 1% improvement would unlock that 5 million of incremental revenue. This sequencing change could unlock as much as 35 million of incremental revenue for merchant A. Now, there's many more strategies that you can use to amplify auth rates, including, as I mentioned earlier, that direct collaboration with issuers to address the gaps in their visibility. Now, Jeff, I know you've pioneered Forta's partnerships with issuers. What can you tell us about the impact that this will have on payment performance?
And there's also a question for Adam or for Jeff. The question is, can all merchants make this shift to pre-auth? And is there a limit based on the merchant's payment stack?
Yeah, that's a great question. So absolutely, all merchants are in a position to be able to make the shift. Obviously, there would need to be resources available to facilitate any changes in the implementation and work with your fraud vendor to ensure that they can support that flow. But there's no real limitation that would stop a merchant from being able to implement this prior to the authorization. And Jeff, over to you to talk about the issuer partnerships that we've been establishing.
Yeah, I think before I hop slides, I think look, I'm very passionate about sharing transaction context with issuers. And I think this slide does a very good job of where that passion began for me. In my days at Microsoft on the payment side, on the merchant side of the house, we looked at graphs like this all the time. We monitored auth rate every single day. When it went down, we wanted to know why. When it went up, we wanted to know why. And we always ask the question, when you look at a graph like this, why is it not at 100? Yeah, it's going up, right? But it can always be better. And e-commerce auth rates are very different than in-store auth rates. If you look at in-store, they're much more 98, 99. And the question fundamentally that we wanted to answer when we started this whole issuer engagement project was, why can't it be 100? What are you missing? What do you not understand? What do you not know about this transaction that keeps me at 90 versus 100 or 86 or 84, whatever your auth rates are? And that has really opened up this world of issuer engagement, of conversations around transaction context and things like that. But this graph I love. If you're not looking at a graph and asking that question, why not more? But you're not thinking about what all the possibilities are that are out there. All right. The question became, when we started talking to issuers, when Forder talks to issuers, what do you know? What do you know about these transactions? What do you know about these merchants? And the answer is not a lot. If you know the history of e-commerce payments and where they come from, the ISO 8583 message was built in the 80s. There was no email address. There was no IP address. There was barely bits and bytes of information as we took an in-store card present transaction and just blueprinted that over to the e-commerce world. And that ISO standard still exists today. So when we say, yeah, issuers are pretty blind in terms of making risk decisions, it's not really a fault of theirs. They're doing the best they can with the information they've been given, but there's just a whole world of data that they don't have access to. And that's what we think merchants need to aim to solve. So this slide gives a general depiction here of, let's take an average merchant authorization rate in the US, let's call it 88%. That means 12% of my transactions are declined by the banks. When Forder looks at that 12%, when we talk to our issuing partners and we go, okay, well, how much of that is, back to the first slide, policy, risk, processing errors, about 20%. Again, it changes based on the issuer, but roughly 20% of those declines in the US at least are coming from the risk system of the issuer. So they don't trust it for whatever reason. When we overlay that with the fraud decisioning that Forder does, we look at those customers and go about half, roughly 40% of those issuer declines due to risk. We see them and go, no, that's the right customer. That's the good identity, that they're on the right device, they're in the right location, this is their purchasing pattern, all the good risk signals that a fraud provider will look into on the merchant side. The issuer goes, yeah, it looked scary to me, so I declined it. So all this to say, we say the 1% here on the bottom, but if you can solve that fundamental trust issue between a merchant and an issuing bank, and you can increase your authorization rate by 1%, go from 88 to 89, that money right there for the vast majority of merchants is worth it. 1% jump, 100 basis points. It is tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to your business. Then yeah, you should be exploring it. Absolutely. There's opportunity in this space. And I think that's really what we've seen over the past couple of years here at Forder is when you can solve this, it's real dollars. The data gap. I love this slide. This is a good marketing slide. We use it in a lot of the conferences we go to and talk about this is what's falling off for the issuer. A merchant making their good risk decision has access to all of this data. Forder has access to all this data. When we're thinking about who is the identity, who's interacting with the website, I know their device, I know their location, I know the email, the IP, I know if they're masking it. The issuer, they're getting a card number and an amount, and probably a strange version of your merchant name. So the solution here is solve it. How do you do that? How do you go fix this lack of context that an issuer has to make a good risk decision? So this is where the top part of this graph comes in. How do you bridge that data gap? Can a merchant share transaction context with the issuer, things like email and IP address? And can an issuer, now this new world in 2025 we're exploring is, can the issuer tell the merchant directly back what they really did? No longer should this world of do not honor ever happen. An issuer wants to tell you, right? They want to tell you, yeah, I had the right data. I found a good match on my side. No, I don't trust that IP address, and here's why. Data sharing goes both ways. So yes, merchants have a lot to gain here from just giving the data to the issuer, but there's also a whole nother world to explore of getting data back. What can you do with that? How do you know if it's confirmed fraud versus a chargeback versus a fraud notification? There's data on the issuing side they want to share with you. So this is what Forder and a lot of folks in the industry are now kind of pioneering is give context, receive context back. Just to give you some data, everybody likes data in these webinars. This is Forder data. When we turn on data sharing, there is a direct correlation to false positive reduction. So the order amount matters. On the x-axis here, you can see a variety of order amounts. These are all merchant within our processing network, where we're sharing data with the issuers, getting responses back, and understanding when an issuer overturned that decline into an approval. The example here, I think, is $111. You'll see that it's about 55, 60% false positive reduction. These are big numbers on the y-axis. This is not overturning 2 or 3 transactions a month. This is reducing that 20% population by almost half, more than half in a lot of cases. So again, proof hopefully in the pudding that yes, when you give issuers the actual context around a transaction, they can do a whole lot with it. All right, I'm going to pass it back. Adam, we've left you a few minutes here to talk about payload processing here.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so shifting focus beyond understanding the decline codes, the importance of stack sequencing, and bridging the data gap with issuers, merchants have the ability to influence how each transaction is processed within that existing ISO spec, even where there are some technical limitations. But what we see is quite often those granular controls go underutilized. So in this section, we're going to look at the routing decisions that a merchant can and should consider that can have a great impact on authorization rates. So when we think about the routing decisions for a given transaction, it can often feel from the merchant's perspective like, well, I've received a transaction, I can send it to 3DS or I can send it to authorization. And that's a very important decision. You should understand both the consumer's past behavior. Are they likely to complete a 3DS challenge? What's the issuer's preference when it comes to 3DS? Are they likely to grant a frictionless 3DS flow based on this transaction's characteristics and their past performance? Or do we want to tactically utilize 3DS to shift liability for a transaction that we think is maybe sitting in the gray area of the risk spectrum? But there's a lot more that we can look at beyond this, even at the specific transaction level. So processor routing, we're seeing a very positive trend among the sophisticated merchants that we're working with, moving towards a multi-processor setup. So multi-processor setups are not new. Global merchants have been combining multiple processors for geographic coverage for a very long time. But what we're starting to see a shift towards is layering of those processor relationships for the same geographies as well. So you're unlocking multiple paths for each transaction, and then you're able to intelligently select the best path for a transaction based on that given transaction's characteristics and the past performance that you're seeing, perhaps also based on the cost for each PSP or acquirer or processor that you're working with. So taking into consideration what would it cost to process this transaction? What's the past performance of this PSP for a transaction with similar traits, similar same issuer behind the scenes? For example, different PSPs represent different levels of perceived risks to issuers based on the performance that they happen to have processed from those issuers' cardholders in the past. And so being able to identify those minute variances in performance and exploit those to your benefit by factoring those into your processing decisions can lead to gains in your authorization rate performance. Card network routing is something that often goes underutilized by merchants, but often there are multiple networks available to process a transaction. When we think about the US, there are the credit rails, the Visa and MasterCard. We have local debit networks such as Acer, Pulse, and Star as well. Or in Europe, we have various examples of the international rails, again, Visa or MasterCard, or the domestic rails like Carte Bancaire in France or Bank Contact in Belgium. The decision over which network to use can have an important impact on performance as well. Some issuers, especially those kind of incumbent legacy issuers that have long-standing technical setups and risk models, may perform better through the domestic networks that they're connected to than the international networks. And there may also be a cost saving with going through a domestic network versus an international. Um, Finally, the credential that you use for authorization, whether it's a network token or a PAN. While the networks will often promote a performance improvement that can come from network tokens, the reality is that performance can vary quite significantly based on the issuer themselves and their risk model, their authorization stacks capability to process that transaction, and indeed to recognize network tokens as a lower risk credential than a PAN. So having models in place that can understand the issuer's past behavior, whether it was with a network token or a PAN, and the impact that that had on the likelihood of success, can be factored in then to the routing decisions for you as a merchant. Do I use the PAN, the card number that's printed on the card itself, or do I use a network token, which is a tokenized digital instance of that same physical card? So these together are incredibly important decisions that a merchant can make that each one individually can have an impact on authorization rates. But when implementing these decisions, it's important to acknowledge that each component is interconnected. The 3DS decision will influence the network decision, and so on. If we're using a network token, then we're going to have to process it via the network that provisioned that token. So embracing that complexity can be quite challenging. And the way that we like to see this, if we jump ahead a slide, is to think about these as a holistic decision. So here, the visual is demonstrating a decision that's been made for a certain transaction. It's a scenario that our routing model has determined that based on analysis of past performance for the given kind of hypothetical transaction we're reviewing here, there's an 80.5% chance of success and a 75-cent cost attached if we were to choose to process the transaction without 3DS via the local debit network in the US with the raw PAN, the card number, via the merchant's second processor that they have integrated. And so what the model's done here is it's looking at every single possible routing scenario, whether we go through 3DS and then debit card B, or we go frictionless 3DS debit card B, or no friction, major network token, and A. You can imagine all of the possible scenarios here that need to be evaluated. And that complexity is a great example of why it doesn't make sense to manage these routing decisions through static rules. We really recommend embracing an ML-based model that can dynamically adjust these recommendations in real time. Now, if we jump ahead to the next scenario, again, we're looking at this same hypothetical scenario. The model has also determined that if we use 3DS frictionless via the major card network with a network token, and we use processor A, there's an 82% probability of success. So slight increase on the other scenario that we were looking at. But there's a $1.25 cost attached to that processing. So depending on how the merchant chooses to weight their own strategic objectives, whether it's towards cost optimization or conversion, or maybe somewhere in the middle, the optimal decision that's been kind of calculated by the routing model here would either be this slide we're looking at with the 82% success probability optimizing for conversion, or perhaps on the previous slide, since the difference between the success likelihood was fairly marginal, maybe we would prioritize the cost reduction and the cost efficiency that we can secure there. But the importance of having a model that can assess all of these hypotheticals and then come to a decision based on the analysis of past performance that is driven by your underlying strategy, whether that's cost optimization, risk optimization, conversion optimization, or a blend of the three. This really, really underlines the importance of a capable and sophisticated kind of ML-based decisioning engine. And then jumping into the next slide, if that first attempt that we make based on the recommendation from the model, for whatever reason fails, it's important to be able to dynamically adapt and adjust those recommendations. So a system that is kind of based on static rules, if the issuer makes a configuration change or the PSP implements a new optimization capability, your static rule set isn't going to be able to adapt in real time. And there's a reliance on manual analysis of performance and this kind of slow time to react and then bake that back into the system. A model that can adapt in real time based on the responses that were received. So in this scenario, a do not honor. If we jump into the next slide, we can then immediately trigger a retry with the next best possible route for that transaction, with a view to recovering that transaction successfully. So there's a lot of complexity here, but a huge amount of opportunity and some real improvement that can be driven through the authorization rate as a result. So with everything we've covered today in mind, I'm sure I know we've had some questions as we go. I'm sure there have been some more questions coming through. So Jeff, I'll hand over to you to take us into Q&A.